so impressed with all the work that you've been doing, and so excited to just see how many people are on a call on a Saturday afternoon. It's just wonderful. So before I became a professor, I was an organizer, a full-time organizer. I worked from the time I was 18 until I was 43, something like that. And so organizing was my first and long-term career. I became a professor at 45, and I've been teaching at Rutgers. And I teach in the Labor Studies and Employment Relations program. I teach a course on organizing. It's called Organizing for Social Change every other semester. And I've been doing that for, I don't know, probably 12 or 13 years. It's based on the curriculum I developed when for all the years I was actually teaching organizing to people who were becoming organizers, to leaders who were involved in organizing, and in both labor and community contexts. So what I thought I would do is just, I know that the question that Jessica asked me to address is about service and organizing, but I thought that maybe what I should do in order to get there is back up a little bit and talk about organizing. So here's my plan. In the time I have, I was going to talk a little bit, just give a little wrap about what is organizing from my perspective, then talk about 4 principles of organizing, then talk about service versus organizing, and then lastly, talk about radical service and hybrids and those kinds of things, so that, you know, we can, in the spirit of what's been said, I mean, you're all such thinkers and strategists, and you know, so I want to sort of lay out some ideas, and then hope that we'll have some time to kind of go back and forth, but understand that that I think that it's best if I sort of, if I'm a little bit provocative about organizing versus service, understand that I understand the grays, and that I understand the subtleties, and that I understand the practicalities. Don't take any of this as an attack or a critique of the amazing mutual aid work that's going on. I feel like what I want to do is work our way toward that, and then put it in the context of radical service in the women's movement and the Black Panthers movement and others, and kind of understand, okay, so how can organizing and service march hand in hand, and you know, how can service be done in a way that encourages organizing? But to get there, I want to start with the basics. Are you following me so far? Is this making sense? Okay, I just want to say that if we were teaching, I would be kind of asking you questions. There would be much more like kind of going back and forth. I know that we don't have time, and so I just want you to know that I'm breaking my own pedagogic rules by just outing with it right now, but that's what I'm going to do. So fundamentally, when I teach organizing, I always say that organizing is moving people into relationship, reflection, leadership, and action, and that it's a cycle, really. Relationship, reflection, leadership, action, and it's kind of a constant cycle. That it's building collective power. It's moving people into relationship, reflection, leadership, and action in order to build their collective power, take greater control over their own lives and communities, and achieve shared goals. So I think of organizing as a form of leadership, right? That a huge part of what we do is identify, recruit, and develop the leadership of others. And we build community around that leadership, and we build power from the resources of that community. So, you know, the iron rule of organizing, right, is never do for others what they must do for themselves. I really like the way that that Frederick Douglass said that. He said, "He who would be free must strike the blow." And I understand that, you know, we would correct his gendered pronouncement, but I hope you don't miss out on the message, right? So the way I use it is, "They who would be free must strike the blow." And so really the idea is that organizers organize a community to become a constituency, people who are able to stand together on behalf of their common concerns. So organizers ask 3 questions. Who are my people? What is their problem? And how can they turn their resources into the power to solve their problem? And the answers that we develop, we do in dialogue with the constituency by building relationships, telling stories, devising strategies, designing structure, taking action. And most important, and maybe sometime we can come back and I'll talk to you about this, is power, right? The most important, to me, the most important conversation we're not going to have today is about power and leveraging power, identifying forms of power, leveraging power. So that's for next time. Organized communities learn to strategize about how they can turn the resources they have into the power they need to get what they want. So that's really, a kind of an overview. And they work through campaigns, right? So campaigns are energized and focused, and they ratchet up power and participation over time so that they're capable of engaging in tactics that require more power over time. Campaigns polarize by bringing out those ordinarily submerged conflicts that are contrary to the interests of the constituency. And campaigns are challenging for organizations like DSA because we're always stuck in the tension between campaigning and building the organization. And it's not, a part of I help run an organization called the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, CIWO. And one of the pieces of work that I lead on at CIWO is called Build the Base. And a lot of that, my obsession is, how do we build power? How do we build membership? How do we build models of distributed organizing and distributed leadership? And so a lot of what I've seen over the course of, many, many years of being an organizer and studying and writing about organizing is that tension between building the power and then acting on the power you've created, and continually always being in recruitment mode. A friend of mine once said to me, if you believe your organization is all built, it's in the process of dying, right? It's like this idea that you have to constantly be building and recruiting. Okay, so 4 principles for organizing, the way I think about organizing. 1, the campaign fundamentally works with the people who are directly affected by the problem, the constituency, and gives them a sense of their own power, right? So that's the first. Working with the people who are directly affected by the problem, shaping them into a constituency, and ensuring that everything you're doing is giving them a sense of their own power. If I were teaching, you would see my very first class. You're all invited. Lots of people sit in on my classes. I'm starting in the January 24th, I guess, is my first class. It'll be every Thursday. If you want to sit in, you're more than welcome. I always start by asking my students, what do you do when you're in a fight with a bully? And I don't want to go through that whole rap here, but suffice it to say that if we don't give people a sense of their own power, then we're not fundamentally doing something that allows them to be able to defend themselves, because organizing really is about, it's always asymmetric power. It's always taking on a bully. And we don't do people any favors if we fight on their behalf alone, right? Because we won't always be around, or we might change our minds. So that's the first principle. The second principle is win concrete improvements in people's lives. And I think that's pretty straightforward, but I think that fundamentally people are attracted to organizations that get things done and that accomplish things, and that the idea of thinking about concrete demands and campaigns and victories that can be won, and then building on those victories, is the bread and butter of organizing. And then the one that, to me is the most important is, I always see issues as secondary to building the organization. Fundamentally, it's about altering the relations of power, right? That you want a community to end up in a situation where, like, let's take Princeton, incredibly privileged Princeton, right? We want Princeton to have to take into account what we think, because they understand that there's a power constituency that exists, and that if they don't take that constituency into consideration, it will cause them major problems. So the idea is that we want to alter the relations of power, and the way to do that is by building permanent organization. So in my view, the organization is a precious, precious thing. And we do not risk the organization by, taking on issues that people are not, there's not a lopsided majority that feel really good about it. We don't do it by, forming our firing squads in circles, right? That we have to really treat the organization as something very precious and very difficult to build. And that if we want to fundamentally alter the relations of power, targets are always waiting for us to go away, right? Because most organizations do. Altering the relations of power in a community means that we have to build permanent organization. And then the fourth principle that I think I heard woven all through your conversations as I waited to give my talk is that we need to build toward longer term social transformation. So as we're working on a campaign and we're thinking about involving those who are directly affected, and we're thinking about winning concrete improvements in people's lives and altering the relations of power, as we're working on the campaign, we aren't just talking with people about that particular victory. We're putting it of the longer term goal that we're trying to achieve. And we're asking ourselves, how does this issue, how does this demand, how does this campaign aid us in building toward that vision? Okay, I got you so far? Okay, so now I want to turn to service versus organizing. And I want to share my screen for a second, and I want to just sort of walk through with you. So again, this is an exercise that I do with my students. It's called the hungry person exercise. We're not going to do it now, but the idea is that I want you to think about how service and organizing differ in terms of how someone is treated. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. Oops. Oops. Can you guys see this? No, okay. Nope, that's not it.
That's it.
You can see it? Okay, great. So I don't want you to take this as like the tablets, all right? I want you to kind of, but I'm trying to give you a conceptual framework by thinking about this. So I want you to always ask yourself, right, when you compare service and organizing, these questions. In service, the focus is on taking care of individual and discrete needs and wants. In organizing, it's about building power, right? And that's kind of what we talked about. In service, the dynamic is often that we respond by creating programs. In organizing, we respond by relating and learning and acting. The next one is what's really important, right? It's the difference between in service, often people are seen as clients or customers. And in organizing, people are seen as leaders or potential leaders or engaged members. Often staff are playing this role as they're viewed as like a provider, as a professional, as a manager, as a therapist, as a social worker, or some kind of government official. In organizing, staff is seen as focused on scouting and developing leaders. And the tools are different too, right? In organizing, our tools are one-on-one meetings and teaching and training and power analysis, action and evaluation. But in service, it's more about administration and central control. So I'm gonna stop this. Well, I'll leave it up here for a minute, but what I wanted to also raise with you is, in some ways, more importantly, in the exercise that I do, I ask people to answer this question. how does the organization see the root causes of the person's problem? Whose fault is it that the person has this problem? And how is that being communicated to the person? Does that make sense? So, right, how does the organization see the root cause of the person's hunger or person's problem? Whose fault is it that the person is having this problem? And then the other question to ask is, does the organization change the relationship between the person with the problem who is getting the service and oppression? Right? How does this process alter that experience? So now let me just go to let me stop screen sharing and go back to my notes. Okay, so you're asking yourself, does the service change the relationship between the person we are serving and oppression, or the system that is oppressing them? And the challenge really is like, sort of asking ourselves, how can we do that? So what I thought I would do is just say a little bit about radical service and hybrids, and maybe what we could do is talk a little bit about how we put mutual aid. I know you guys have been doing some reading about mutual aid and its roots in the context of this radical tradition. A lot of my research work has been done looking at worker centers like New Labor and Wind of the Spirit and Make the Road, New Jersey, and but I have studied them all over the country, written a lot about them, and spent a lot of time looking particularly at the relationship between service, organizing, and advocacy. And so one of the things that I wanted to say, right, is that there is this tradition in organizing to say that service is a bad idea. And the reason is because very often it's done in a way that disempowers the people who are, well, fundamentally, if we want to make structural change, service is really good work, but it's hard if we end up spending the vast majority of our time doing service. And so in some ways, it's about a division of labor, right? It's about understanding that there are a lot more service providers than there are organizers and people who are focused on structural change of the polity and the economy. And so that requires some hard choices. So then why would we do service at all, right? What is it about, in an organizing context, why would we do it? We do it, right, in part because we're trying to meet the needs of our constituency, right? We're trying to do something in the here and now. And we do it because when we're organizing, particularly if we're working with people who are low income, immigrants, BIPOC, et cetera, it's really hard to just like look away when people's whole lives are in challenge or people are struggling. So any organizer that tells you that they never helped their leaders, that they never engaged in some service provision is probably not telling you the truth, right? I feel like it happens, right? But the issue is that it's really important to keep the focus on structural change and organizing and involving leaders in a transformational experience of building and then using power. Is it okay to keep going?
If we have, okay. We have 10 minutes, but we can go like 5 or 10 minutes over time if we need to.
So what was different about the way that Panthers, for example, and the women's movement provided service? One was that service was a gateway to organizing and movement, right? So it legitimated them, it provided concrete help, right? But it was a gateway to organizing and movement. It was connected to political education. It was connected to action, right? So yes, people got fed, right? Yes, there were lunch programs, and there were, people got abortions, right? And women got abortions, and and got all kinds of experience creating sex education and reproductive rights work and education before Roe versus Wade. So, so in that regard, it was also prefigurative, right? It was an action that people, it was something that people took part in that encapsulated the world we were trying to build. So, so it was prefigurative, connected to political education, connected to a movement, a gateway to organizing, and the constituency was organizing, not just receiving a service, right? So the constituency was taking part in their own liberation. So, okay, so I'm just going to end with some challenges, and I can do this quickly, and then we'll be done. So one question is, what should we expect of the people who are receiving the service, right? That's a really important discussion to have. A second is, how can the people who are receiving the service be involved in the work? My experience is that people always want to be involved in the work. They don't want to just be on the receiving end. That's the idea, right? Fundamentally, from what I can tell about mutual aid, right? But it's also that a lot of times, I hate to say this, but a lot of the organizing groups have revolutionary politics and social work ideology. They have they won't ask poor people for money. And if you talk to poor people, they know that if they don't own the organization, someone else is going to own it. They know things cost money, and they know things worth having cost money. So the idea of not asking people for money, in my view, is not organizing, right? That organizing is about the power of organized people and organized money. So one way that people can have a different relationship to it is by mixing their labor and their money, whatever that is, in the service itself. So there are lots of organizations that provide services in order to bring in income, support things that their constituents need, and then use that service money and convert it into resources for organizing. That's great. The key is, how does that organization remain democratic, focused on organizing, and accountable to a constituency, right? And what often happens in the sort of foundation, because organizations are so dependent on raising foundation money, is that instead of building a membership base and asking people to contribute their own dues as the basis for the organization, they become entirely dependent on foundation money. And you know, that creates all kinds of incentives to be accountable to foundations rather than to people. So another question would be, how do you build an accountability to a constituency and the main purpose remaining organizing in the service? And then another really tricky question is, that I worked on this a lot with the worker centers, was, can you ask people to join the organization as a prerequisite to receiving service? And also, can you ask them, for example, let's say they get a settlement, right? They sue the boss, they do a wage and hour claim, or they do a private right of action and they win, right? The idea is, can you actually ask that people, when you take their case, that they're going to tithe back to the organization some percentage of the, you know, of what's collected. So those are just some thoughts about what is organizing, about principles of organizing, about the difference between organizing and service, and about radical service. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
Do you have time for a few questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. If anyone wants to ask a question, you can put stack in the chat. I can go first. Do you have thoughts on sort of like the pandemic? Because I think out of the pandemic, like so many people and community members across the country started different mutual aid efforts. And have you seen people move from harm reduction in, like, you know, a moment of emergency, but now it's been 9 months? Have you seen anything interesting of how people have moved from service to organizing?
Well, you know, I'm working right now with the Coalition of Worker Centers and Unions and community organizing groups, that one from the governor's office, Executive Order 192, and then funding to do training around health and safety. And as part of the training around health and safety, we made a demand on the state to fund it. And now we're working on, as the organizations are doing the training and identifying violations, working on turning those violations into organizing opportunities, and also using the identification of violations and filing cases to push the state very hard on some demands that people are making on the state. So that's one example that I have, direct experience with. Another is that we're pushing for workplace health and safety liaisons. So the idea would be that we would use the training that's provided to health and safety to workers to load them up to be able to, go and do organizing in their workplaces. So that's an example, right, of how do you use service in a way that's a bit of jujitsu, right? Get those resources to do the training, use it to teach people how to organize, because that's really what's gonna, right? The way we're gonna deal with health and safety in the workplace is when we stand up to it, and we stand up to the boss collectively. And so, I see these programs as a way to, to be able to bring that message for workers themselves, to bring that message to other workers.
Thank you. Mariah, you're on stack.
Yeah, this is related to something you mentioned in the beginning. You mentioned that one of the first things that we should consider doing when organizing is figure out which community we can, I guess, relate to or be in touch with and such. I guess my only question or issue with that is this is a specific experience that I've had with certain online groups, but people will specifically join certain groups because they don't have a connection to any community and they're looking for a community to have connection to. So in that case, how do people in that space go on and form bonds and connections communities when they specifically join the organization because they don't have connections or bonds to any community?
That's such a good question.
Basically,
yeah.
Organizing for antisocial people. How do you do it?
Yeah, I'm married to one of those people. But I think that I want to be clear that building a socialist party, I think, is different, right? I think what you guys are doing is different, and I think we could talk about it more, sort of what does it mean? But let's give you an example. What was really exciting to me about Aisha and Fatma and other people who were working with me when we started working on immigrant rights and asylum cases and building Solidarity at Princeton was that they got that we just didn't want to walk into workplaces and hand out something saying, here's your rights, right? Let me talk to the boss. Oh, hi, here's a flyer that tells you what your workers' rights are. That the point was to say, can we talk to the workers, right? So it's that we as organizers are looking for constituencies, right? Some constituencies are organized and some are yet to be organized. But the idea of an organization, I guess what I think is that you have to figure out the foundation upon which power and organized people can lead to power. And to me, that means that, if you're going to work with low-wage Latinx workers, then your focus as an organizer is building an organization of low-wage Latinx workers and not speaking on their behalves, right? If you're going to build an organization of name the constituency, right? For example, Black Lives Matter, right? It's a really tricky balance, right? Between our showing up versus our doing what we can do to really support a Black organization really being, right? I mean, we can be anti-racist, of course, and, we can be good allies, but, or if we want to build an organization of white, rural, working class people, right? It's the same. So what you're saying is in the digital space, there's all this opportunity for people to come together. How do we think about constituency differently when there's all these different people that are kind of coming forward? And I don't want to act like I know simple answers. A huge part of what I do is really thinking about constituency, right? So I'm thinking about, okay, we've got 6% of private sector unionization. We've got 3% in, in restaurants, and we've got, you know, the numbers are ridiculous. So I'm always thinking about constituency, honestly, right? I'm less thinking about, you know, about how do you bring people together, you know, what do you do with people who don't necessarily fit into a constituency? I'm thinking about how do we use the spaces you're describing to find people who can then be plugged into organizations that are, you know, that are doing, you know, that are doing organizing. But let's say they're not, right? Let's say they're, you know, well, so I'm just gonna leave it there for now, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it. I think it's an intriguing question, and I really appreciate that you asked it.
Kristen had asked about Janice's class. So Janice said her class will be in person and also virtual. Anyone who's interested in taking it can contact her at the email that's in the chat, and that she just asks that people fully participate, don't just attend it sporadically. Does anyone else have any other questions? If I can ask one more, since I don't see anyone else back. Can you sort of maybe, we've done this before in our workshops about organizing, but I think I would love to hear your perspective. You have the chart, but like articulating the difference between service, mobilizing, and organizing. And I think it's the mobilizing and organizing that a lot of people might have some difficulty with.
Yeah, again, I spend a lot of time on this in my classes. I'm not a purist, right? And so, you know, there are some who argue, you know, organizing is organizing and we should never mobilize. And that's just, you know, organizing to me, the difference is that that is the work of identifying people, being very careful about providing pathways as people come into our organizations, for welcoming them, for doing political education with them, for getting a sense of who they are through one-on-ones, figuring out where they fit, and developing their leadership, and building democratic structures and teams and coaching and all the work that goes into building durable, long-term structure where people grow and leaders are constantly taking on new tasks, and people are coming in and have an opportunity to become leaders. And the most important thing to me is, how do we embed a tapeworm in the organization, an engine for growth in the organization, so it has the capacity to keep growing, right? Mobilizing is when we give people opportunity to come out and attend activities, and we ask people to come out to rallies. And, you know, I love movements, right? I think movements are great. It's just that, you know, most of the time we're not living in a movement moment. And so I think mobilizing, you know, is turning people out for actions, turning people out for events, telling people about something, and when it's a movement, that's all they need, and they come out, right? But to me, organizing is the you know, work of the weaving and the knitting and the developing and the attending to renovating a space, so that we're constantly thinking about what's the DNA, how do we front load a set of practices so that when people come in, we're ready for them, and they can participate in the organization, and you know, and develop their leadership in a meaningful way, so that we are constantly growing, particularly leaders. So to me, it's connected to whether we're building strategic capacity or not. I don't think we build strategic capacity when we mobilize alone. It has to be, you know, kind of, we have to center organizing, but it doesn't mean we never mobilize. Of course we do.
Yeah, I think people need to stop being afraid of taking their own power and like learning about their own skills, and then not being afraid to use them. Raya has one question, and then I think we have to close it off.
Yeah, sorry, I just, no one else was going, so I figured I might as well take a second one. I guess for my big question, it's from what I've seen was trying to like reach out to certain communities, is a big problem might be is like communities are not, well, by their very nature, they're not a monolithic group. So sometimes it's hard to say connect to them is kind of like a very broad, basically, oftentimes the idea of trying to like organize or connect with a community can be a very broad or vague goal that oftentimes there's no immediate clear direction to how to proceed with that. I've seen attempts where like, and be fair, where like a group might try to like have an event where they talk to members of a certain community, but they might get out, but like the wrong people who they don't want to talk to might come out, or they don't really have too many people who want to talk to them, etc. So I guess how do you, I guess, narrow it down so that there's a
Well,
sense of direction for what an
yeah, I
otherwise
mean,
a broad and
again,
vague
like
goal?
I see it as a process, right? And so you would like, let's say I wanted to organize my neighborhood. And just as you say, right, some people in my neighborhood are cranks, right? Some of them are a pain in the ass. Some people are going to be people other people can't stand, right? So if I don't do my work and I'm not like knocking on doors and having conversations and, you know, really getting to know, you know, like sort of that, using that process, I would want to have hundreds of conversations before I pull together a meeting or I, you know, right? So that, so the idea is that organizing takes time, right? And it's a process. And so whatever the constituency is, whatever you're trying to do, right? You got to get to know the terrain. And I'm assuming, right, there's going to be old rivalries, social networks, tensions, people that know each other, families that don't talk to each other, you know, or, right? And I got to sort of figure out and think about that stuff. And right. And so it's like that whenever you are going to go in and, you know, whether that's a workplace, God knows, right? You know, or, you know, it's not a tabula rasa, right? There's all kinds of stuff. And what organizers do in a lot of ways is we identify the networks that are there and then we repurpose them in some ways, right? But first we have to understand them, right? Because otherwise you're going to make really dumb mistakes. So, you know, it's just thinking through that you have to patiently, and you have to love this part of the work, right? Like to me, it's the funnest part, right? Is all those hundreds of one-on-ones and the getting to know people. You have to be radically curious about people in order to be a good organizer, right? And so it's sort of like you're putting together, you know, some sense of the work, and you're not going to know right away. And if you think after, you know, 3 conversations, you know anything, you know, you got to think again.
Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts before we close the meeting?
Well, I hope people appreciate, you know, got something out of this. I hope I didn't talk too long to keep you from asking questions, but I really, I'm really impressed with the work you're doing, and it's wonderful to see Aisha and Fatma and you know, this amazing organization that you're all part of. I'm a member of DSA and proud to be, have been forever, and so really happy that such an active chapter is you know, is happening right in my own backyard. And also I'm very serious about taking the course. So if you want to do that, don't be shy, get in touch.
Thank you so much. That's so generous. Thank you so much.
Yep.
So if anyone has questions about that, Janice put her email, but we can also follow up later if you need us to. I think everything that you talked about is going to really help us move forward into 2021, because we are trying to refocus and strategize and use our membership like effectively and figure out how we move from advocacy and service into really training our own members and then training the people we work with to be organizers, because we're facing a lot and we got to get on it.
Well, I'm really impressed with the work you're doing. And if you want me to come back ever to talk about power or strategy planning or anything like that, if I can work it out with my schedule, I'm happy to do that.